All right, welcome everybody. My name is Sebu David Arslanyan, in case you didn't know me. And I'm professor of history here at UCLA and the Victor Vanessian Chair of Modern Armenian History. I'm also honored to be the inaugural director of the Armenian Studies Center here at UCLA's Armenian Promise Armenian Institute. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this auspicious event. You wouldn't maybe not know of it, given the room, but organized by the Armenian Studies Center here and at the Promise Institute, as well as the UCLA, as well as my chair at UCLA, and co-sponsored by the Center of Near Eastern Studies in the Armenian Music Program. I'd like to thank all of you for coming in person for this to this event and for listening through Zoom for those unable to attend. And I'd like to express my gratitude here to Hasmik Baldasarian, the Deputy Director of the Promise Armenian Institute, and to Anne Karagosian, the Director of the Institute, as well as to a number of friends and colleagues, including Ali Behdad, the Director of CNES, who is also co-sponsoring this event, and Moses Bogosian and Melissa Bilal of the Armenian Music Center here at UCLA. At least for the past 3 or 4 years, my colleague Kayvon Harris, who is with us today, has been pestering me in some ways about inviting Ian Nagoski and praising his talents and his work in conducting rescuing operation to rescue and make live again the forgotten and therefore silenced voices from the Armenian past. Due to reasons that are all too familiar to us here, namely COVID, war, and numerous forms of pestilence, political and otherwise, I was unable to fulfill my oath to Kayvon and also to my conscience in honoring both Mr. Nagoski as well as his team of collaborators in making this event possible tonight. I'm very honored to finally act on my convictions. Before I introduce our speakers for tonight, permit me to say a few short words about why I feel strongly about honoring both Zabelle Panosian and Ian Nagoski and his team. So born in the predominantly Armenian town of Bardizag or Bakhchechik in 1891, emigrated to the United States in 1907, and passed away in New York City as late as 1986, Zabelle Panosian was a gifted singer, performer, and humanitarian who devoted a good part of her life to bringing newness into this world in the form of her musical performances, and raising awareness also to the plight of her people in the Ottoman Empire while living in the multicultural landscape of America. Despite literally recording her melodious voice on numerous vinyl records or inscribing her name on the surface of history in the form of numerous interviews and written documents, she was eventually consigned to oblivion by the very people for whom she literally poured her heart out in the form of music. Even while she was alive, as Nagoski points out in his copiously researched biography, Zabelle was beginning to be forgotten. Today, although many of us remember the genocide and often go to great lengths to remonstrate that we shall never forget and so on, few of us remember the various individuals whose lived experiences were braided into the melancholy history that is the Western Armenian condition in the world. Zabelle Panosian is one of those individuals whose memory and history have been largely relegated to silence and oblivion, and that this fact alone should raise some alarm among us. That she was plucked from history's stream of forgetfulness and oblivion and brought to life again is an act of heroism in my book, hence the occasion for this event. And this fact that someone or some people in this case took the moment to recognize the beauty and distinction in the timbre of Zabelle's voice is what makes me feel an obligation and debt to honor our speakers and the object of their devotion tonight. As a historian who has devoted a good deal of his life to remembering the deceased in history, as someone who takes the French historian Jules Michelet's injunction that one of the most important responsibilities of the historian is to remember the dead, I feel a particular act of commitment in making it possible in some slight way this evening of remembrance and commemoration and celebration. Let me quote a few lines from Michelet's famous speech about the historian and the dead before I move on to saying a few words about the speakers. Michelet writes, "Never in my career have I forgotten to keep sight of this responsibility of the historian. I have given to many of those too forsaken dead the aid that I myself will need. I have exhumed them for a second life. They live among us who feel ourselves to be their relations and their friends. Thus is a family constituted, a city shared between the dead and the living." So before I turn to saying a few things about our speakers' biographies, let me reiterate once again that I think what Nagoski and his team have done for Zabelle is in some ways similar to Michelet's injunction of creating a living organic bond between the present and the living, and as well as the dead. And here, I'd like to read a couple of lines from the preface of Nagoski's biography that I mentioned, which, by the way, is available in limited quantities here, should anyone wish to enjoy it and in exchange offer a modicum of a donation for it. So in this preface, or in the beginning part of this work, I think Nagoski captures a moment where he fell in love with Zabelle's voice and realized the importance of her legacy. And after listening to for the first time to a record of hers, he writes, and I quote here, "My mind went blank. The EKG flattened and I went to heaven." This side ended, this side of the record, the vinyl record, and I played it again just to be sure, and it worked again. The liquid of her voice surrounding me. So with that in place, Ian Nagoski, a few words about Ian himself. Ian is a music researcher and record producer in Baltimore, Maryland. For more than a decade, he has produced scores of reissues of early 20th century recordings in languages other than English for labels including Dust to Digital, Tompkins Square, his own Canary Records, where the recordings are available, I believe, and others. He's enthusiastically been hosted by the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., the Onassis Cultural Center in Athens, Greece, the University of Chicago, the University of Pennsylvania, the University of California, and of course our very own UCLA and Santa Barbara, Carnegie Mellon University in New York, and NYU. He has presented his work in installations at the museum, for Naturkunde in Berlin, Germany, and the Wellcome Center in London, England, and the Center for Post-Natural History in Pittsburgh, as well as the Peel Center in Baltimore, Maryland. His partner in this enterprise, the equally talented Harout Arakelian, is a video editor, music collector, and researcher based here in Los Angeles, who focuses on Armenian contributions to the landscape of art and culture with a specific lens on the Armenian experience. He is actively working on collecting every known commercial recording from the 78 RPM era, and contributes articles regularly to the Armenian Museum of America's Sound Archive, and has begun a series of presentations at Gabriel Bookstore, in addition to being a guest lecturer here at UCLA and delivering presentations at the Armenian Institute in London. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming them. They will be speaking for approximately an hour and plus, after which we will have plenty of time to field questions about this event. So thank you once again for taking the time to be here, and for all of you who are out there listening and viewing this event. Thank you.
thank you so much for everything you said. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I am deeply grateful and feel very fortunate that my life has allowed me to come to a moment like this. This is, I'm a lucky, lucky guy. In relation to the question of memory that was just raised, you didn't come here to find out what my favorite quote from Shakespeare is, but I'm going to tell you. It is from a dumb comedy called Much Ado About Nothing, where one guy says, you know, nowadays you have to build your own monument or else you're forgotten as soon as the bell stops ringing and your widow stops weeping. And the other guy says, well, how long is that? And he says, an hour in clamor and a quarter in room. So 75 minutes, which is exactly how long I'm going to be speaking to you right now. So my name is Ian Nagoski. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. For 25 or 30 years, I've been digging around in musty, crusty, dusty old 78 RPM records that nobody else wants, that are just lying around in heaps and super cheap. I made a rule for myself as a teenager that anything that was in a language other than English, if it was cheap, I would just buy it and listen to it and find out what maybe was good about it and have those experiences, because nobody else seemed to be doing so. And I thought it was fun. It was, you know, interesting. As time went on, I began also accumulating stories about some of the music that I heard, and eventually wound up publishing reissue compilations of some of the material as the stories began to fit together in pieces. And I began specializing about 15 years ago, not only in the music of immigrants to the United States during the first half of the 20th century, but particularly speakers of Greek, Turkish, Armenian, and Arabic. So that's where I'm from and what I do. Now, partway through this process, about 2010, you get introduced to people who might have stories. The best thing. We had the most amazing morning today. Richard Hagopian in Fresno, sitting in his house, and the stories. It's the best thing. I was introduced to another guy near where I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, named Leo Sarkezi, who had a long, amazing career. He was, at the time, 93 years old and just retiring from the Voice of America, where he'd been hired in the early 60s by Edward R. Murrow. He was dispensing with all of the records and books and paintings and stuff he'd accumulated over this incredible life. And he knew we'd hung out. He knew I had questions about the music. He knew I cared about the music. And he said to me, do you want my old records? And I said, yes, that would be great. He said, all right. So he gave me all the 78s, which was all the records that he bought in the 40s and 50s in New York, and all the records that his father and uncle bought in Haverhill, Massachusetts, near Boston, where they worked at the shoe factory in the teens and 20s. They were from Diyarbakir. So I had all these records, carefully drove them home, worried about the trucks, and started just dutifully listening through them. One of them was a Columbia record with an orange label, which was very unusual, more about that later, that was broken, cracked, and I still played, put the needle on it, plays through. First thing you hear is a string quartet and a piano. And my heart sank. It's immediately when you hear string quartet and a piano, you think, all right, here we go, some middle class aspiring values. This is not the down home, authentic, true experience that I think I want. Because, you know, folk, blues, jazz, gospel, this like authentic American thing, that's an aesthetic that's inherited among record collectors. But I waited for a second and the voice came in and I went, oh, okay, you sing very nicely. I think I like you. Let's listen. And then she did a thing with her voice and I stopped, riveted in space and time. And I said, oh no, okay. You're somebody different. And you're telling me the truth. You're not just laying a bunch of your values on me. You're actually speaking something that is you're speaking to the big unseen. You're asking big questions. You matter to me. I don't know what you're saying. I don't know who you are. So I tried to find out who she was. And the first thing I did, first thing anybody would do in 2010, I Googled her name. It said Zabelle Panosian on the label. Who's Zabelle Panosian? And the internet didn't know. Okay. I decided I would include it in a project that I was doing, and going to genealogical sites, I was able to come up with a couple of sentences. I knew that she was 25 years old. I knew that she had a small child. I knew that she was living around Boston, and I knew that it was an old song of some kind. I misattributed it to Shah-Mouradian or somebody else. Wrong. You got to start somewhere. So I started there. That project, when it was published, reached a guy in Michigan named Harout Arakelian, who was also a fan of old music. And he went like, what is this guy doing with my old music, all this Armenian stuff I know about and I grew up with? And he got in touch with me. And he started schooling me, frankly, which is great. So, you know, I don't know. So we start sharing information back and forth, stories. And then we meet Harout Arakelian. And the three of us begin this correspondence over years and years and years, where it's a little competitive. It's a little like one-upping each other with stuff we found out. And at the same time, making connections and going like, oh, well, if this is true, then what if that means this for here? Speculating, building stories, putting together stuff from the pieces of these 3-minute sides of records, where when a person recorded them in 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, that's actually 3 minutes of their life. It's actually what they did in that room at that time. So we all went down the Zabelle Panosian rabbit hole, and over 12 years, we came up with her story, and we got her to stand up and walk around and live and breathe among us again, which I'm very proud of. I'm very fond of her, for one thing. I mean, that's part of the deal. So what I came here to do all this way, with gratitude in my heart, is to tell you some of her story so that the seed of her music and who she was will be planted in your heart and will change you, and you will carry it forward. And it will live on. That's the whole idea. So, to begin, she was not born Zabelle Panosian. She was born Takoui Dermaz-Ropian in 1891 in a town called Bardizag, about 80 miles due east from Constantinople, Istanbul. Town of, yeah, it was, they had 2 churches on the main street, elementary school, 2 silk mills at each end of the street, surrounded by mulberry groves. And it was entirely Armenian speaking, 90-something% people in the town. It was for several hundred years. And they did this, had an autonomous Armenian community there through a combination of discretion and bribery. Kept their head down, quiet, good. And then once a year, you have a Turkish Ottoman official of some kind into town who has some influence. You feed him a nice meal, give him a couple of drinks, hand him an envelope, and say at the end of the dinner, now it seems to us that it might be worth expressing to our neighbors that it is in the benefit of their eternal soul not to be among us non-believers. Don't you think that's true? Isn't that the best thing for them? And they would say, yes, you're right, absolutely, I will communicate that to my countrymen. And so in that way, they were kind of left alone. Zabelle went to elementary school there. She sang in church there. She teaches kindergarten, apparently, for a minute. And then when she's 8 years old, the first bad thing happens, which is her mother dies. We don't know how or why. Then when she's 11 years old, the second bad thing happens. She says twice later on that military men came into her house at night, took her from bed, put her on horseback, rode her off somewhere, and she was made to sing and dance on tabletop for military men at 11 years old, is how she tells it. She was returned, we hope unharmed, but something happened. 15 years old, the next bad thing happens, which there's another abduction attempt. Her father steps in and several family friends, and she is kept safe. But it is at that moment that her father realizes she's not safe here. She's not going to be okay. We have to get her out of here if she's going to be okay. And she apparently, they can't even get a little girl a international passport because of revolutionary activities among Armenians at the time. We're talking here 1906, 07. Armenians were not allowed to have international passports, so they just had internal passports. So she was able to go to Egypt, where apparently family friends got her passage to Boston, where there was another guy from Bardizag, about 10, 15 years older than her, we don't know exactly, in whose care she was given. His name was Armenian Panosian. And they were married, and right after the month after she turns 18, they have a child, Adrina. Aram started work in about 1907-08, right about the time that Zabelle arrives, with the Tickner Brothers Postcard Company, who were significant developers of the mass medium thing of picture postcards in the United States. He was a photo engraver. And he did very well. He really moved into the kind of middle class of Boston. And they were, you know, they did great. And he was extremely supportive of Zabelle. Gave her English lessons. They hired some help to come in because she's, you know, 18, 19 years old, has an infant and all this housework to do, and doesn't speak the language yet. So he helps out, and he's very supportive of her, and gets her singing lessons. She wants singing lessons. Two guys named Hooker and Graham are her first teachers. She says she learns practically nothing from them. And then she finds a woman named Gertrude Duena, who she says taught her the delicacies of the art. And she was very devoted for years to Gertrude Duena. They were very close. Gertrude Duena was a middle-aged woman who was a professional vocal coach, gave regular recitals of her students. At that point, about 1910, America is going through opera mania. Two big opera houses in New York City. Another one springs up in Chicago, one in Philadelphia, one in Boston. The one in Boston is opened up by a guy named Otto H. Kahn. If you've ever seen the Marx Brothers movie Animal Crackers, there's this kind of pompous, assimilated Jewish guy who's hiding his Jewishness named Roscoe W. Chandler, who's an art collector and aficionado. That's Otto H. Kahn. Groucho made fun of him for the rest of his life. Anyway, so Otto H. Kahn builds the Boston Opera House, and it only lasts for 5 years. It's all very well documented. The Boston Opera Company brings in some of the best singers in the world. Nellie Melba, Amelita Gallicurci, Luisa Tetrazzini. These people are massive international stars. And coloratura opera singing in America is like, at that time, is what movie stars became in the 1930s and 40s. It is the height of glamour. And Zabelle falls in love with it. She goes and sees all this stuff, and she begins representing herself as of the Boston Opera Company, which she is not. We have lots of documentation of the Boston Opera Company, who sang what roles for every performance in those 5 years. No, she never had that part. She might have put on a costume and been in the chorus on stage. That's as far as I'm going to go with it. Maybe she just liked it. 1912, she's already singing at community events. The very first one we have documentation of is actually a minstrel show put in together by a ladies' company. But then by 1913, 1914, she's singing regularly for the Armenian community. And she's getting good, and she's getting popular enough that in 1914, she has to take out an ad in an Armenian newspaper asking people, please don't use my name if I'm not actually singing at your event, okay? So that's some measure of popularity, I would say, right? Okay, so she's doing great. Everything's going fine. They bring over her two brothers and her sister during that time, and her husband, Aram, helps out getting them work, starting with the postcard company and then elsewhere, and then the sister's husband. So the family is coming together, and things are going okay in America for Zabelle. And then in 1915, the next bad thing happens. The way it went down in Bardizag was that all the guns had already been taken away, and all the young men had already been conscripted into military service doing like construction projects. And then March 1915, they arrest this group of several dozen men, Constantinople, Istanbul, dentists, composers. different significant figures in the Armenian community. Everybody here probably knows the date, right? Ride them off on a train, and they're in prison. And then in Bardizag, they go and find the community leaders, the men who are in charge, and they take them off and they beat them physically. It's not like in Indonesia in the 60s where you take somebody off and you pour soapy water down them until they vomit uncontrollably as torture, but there's no visible sign of torture. No, they just beat them. So violence is on the table and everybody knows it, right? And then they go to everybody around the town of 10,000 people and they say, here's what's going to happen. You're selling everything right now. All of your rugs, all of your furniture, everything you own, you put on the street. We're inviting everybody from around, and you're going to sell it for a pittance to whoever wants it because you need that money right now to pay to us to deport you. You're leaving. So everybody got on the train, to another train, to another train, to the Syrian desert, marched. And apparently Zabelle found out a couple of years later, that's how her father, who had saved her life, died of starvation. Mulberry groves are destroyed. You had to turn in your keys before you left. All the floorboards of all the houses are torn up. By 1917, of a population of 10,000, there are 36 people left in Bardizag. So that's how it went down. Reports are coming in. Zabelle dedicates the next 3.5, 4 years of her life to relentless philanthropic work. Mostly playing concerts, getting up on stage, singing in benefit of causes for her people back home. Over and over and over again. She raised millions of dollars by herself, doing all kinds of work, doing all kinds of fundraising. You know, there's the world of men sort of doing one, you know, activism and stuff, and there's kind of the world of women who are doing all kinds of other parallel track things. She's right there with all of that. Okay. Beginning of 1915, she meets a guy, an important singer. His name is Armenag Shah-Mouradian. Anybody know Armenag Shah-Mouradian by any chance? No? Okay. He was sort of the, oh yeah, okay, a couple of people. He was the big voice of Armenians of that generation, particularly I would say in the United States. But he was from Mush, a city, a town about 5 times as big as Bardizag. That was split about 50-50 between Muslims and Christians. He winds up going to Georgia and being educated in music by Komitas Vardabet. Anybody know Komitas? Yes. Okay, everybody. Good, good. He's the great patriarch of Armenian music of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Shah-Mouradian is one of his key primary students during that period. He's also a revolutionary who's involved in protests and activism, and he gets arrested twice. Second time, he's led out by a beneficent military figure who says, look, talented young man, go back to your village, keep your nose clean, everything's going to be fine, I'm letting you out. He goes back, he's a choir director for a few years, poor kid, makes it out of there to Paris, gets music lessons from Pauline Viardot, a composer who also herself became rather obscure, but is now rather better known as time is going on. Her family has a music history going back to Mozart. They're deep music people. She's 90-something years old at the time, gives Shah-Mouradian free lessons. And he studies at the Schola Cantorum under Vincent Donghi. Same class, incidentally, as when Eric Satie went back to the Schola Cantorum as an older man. Anyway. So he gets more music lessons in Paris, gets kind of ingratiated into the scene, has his big break as in the starring lead role of Gounod's Faust, and goes from being this poor Armenian boy to a giant international star like that. Tours all over Europe. 1913, 14. 14, he's in Constantinople, Istanbul, meets back up with Komitas Vardabet, his old teacher. And they make a handful of records together. So I'm first going to play you like a minute and a half of one of those records from early 1914 that they did. And here we have a story of a song. It's a folk song that at the time was about 300 years old, we suspect. Harout Arakelian, our collaborator, found the earliest text of it in Aleppo, Syria. It is referred to in this 1919 edition of Songs of Armenia as the Pilgrim's Song to the Crane, but it's called Grunk, Garlunk. I've been corrected. Grunk. That's how I've always called it. I'm from Delaware and I don't read or speak Armenian, and I'm sorry. It's a song that Komitas had included in his work as he was a composer, priest, and an ethnomusicologist who published folk songs in editions in German. Anyway, so they're singing, Shah-Mouradian sings, Komitas plays piano. The lyrics of the song are, I'll just tell you now. Crane, where are you? It's in rather elevated, fancy, old language, but to put it plainly, Crane, where are you coming from? I am servant of your voice. Hasten not to your flock, you will arrive soon enough. Have you any news from home? I got two of those lines mixed up. But that's the idea. Guy who's away from home, missing Armenia, sees a crane, tell me what's going on back home. I want to go back and I want to know what's happening there. Early 1914, Constantine. Please try and remember the melody if you're good at that, if you have an ear for it. Hold on to it. All right, so that's Shah-Mouradian. And that's a song that's been performed and recorded a lot. It's a big, famous song. Shah-Mouradian, after that, can't go back to Paris because World War I has broken out. So instead, he, his wife, and his daughter come to New York City, December 1914. And then, March 1915, Komitas Vardabet is one of the people who is arrested during the onset of the genocide. Shah-Mouradian makes it to New York. January 1915, he meets this young soprano, Zabelle Panosian, who already wants to get involved in activism and fundraising and stuff. And they start doing shows together. They go to Detroit, Syracuse, Toronto. Yeah, they're fundraising. And it starts out, it's Shah-Mouradian's show, and Zabelle's the opening act, and she does two songs, always including Grunk. She sings Grunk, right? They were careful not to step on each other's toes in repertoire, even though they knew some songs in common. Anyway, it's difficult to know about their relationship, actually. But they met, and they would go separate ways, and they'd meet up again, they'd go separate ways. And they were in touch, they were in communication. So Zabelle got the idea in 1916 that she wanted to make records, maybe as a fundraising effort. And she goes to one of the two most important, well, there are only two important record companies in the United States during the first half of the 20th century, Victor and Columbia. Now, pedantic record business stuff that's also interesting for immigrants. Both Victor and Columbia, right about 1908, get this idea in their heads. Can we sell records to immigrants to the United States? America was going through, at the time, the largest wave of immigration it ever saw. Between 1888 and 1920, the number of foreign-born people in the United States was always between 13 and 14%. 1,000 people a day immigrated just through Ellis Island, not to count any other ports, for decades. Huge wave. A third of them from Italy, a third from Eastern Europe, a third from elsewhere. And Zabelle's right in that wave, right? So 1908, they start importing recordings to sell to the immigrants, and they start with the most populous language groups, Germans, Italians, down the line, Czechs, you get to then Greeks. Then by 1912, 1916, coincident with the war, you get the first recordings in the United States to be sold to immigrants in Armenian, Turkish, Arabic. So Zabelle is aware of this going on. She goes to the better of the two record labels, the more prestigious. She goes to Victor Records in Camden, New Jersey. And she records Grunk and a song called Im Sareli Zavagunks, which I'm pronouncing wrong, I know, sorry, my beloved children. And they turn her down. And then Shah-Mouradian goes to Victor and makes a trial record for them, and they turn him down too. Not interested. So a few months later, March 1917, she goes to Victor's competitor, Columbia Records, the Woolworth Building, the tallest building in the world, downtown Manhattan, 60 floors, goes to the 7th floor in an elevator that's run by coal, guys shoveling coal 6 days a week to run the elevator. Anyway, she goes to Columbia's studio, March 1917, and records this handful of 6 songs, her first 3 records. The first of them, Grunk, sounds like hotcakes. It's a massive, massive hit. It speaks directly to the experience that all Armenians in the United States were in. What's going on back home? Because everything you knew, everyone you knew, is gone. And there's no home to go back to. And you're stranded forever here. So everybody bought it. Sold. We don't know figures, but it stayed in print from the end of 1917 until 1931, when Columbia Records deleted its entire Armenian language catalog. So I'm just going to play, that's the record I heard when I got Leo Sarkeesian's collection. I'm going to play it for you now in its entirety, the whole side. Out of respect for Zabelle and because it's just a really good record, and a chance to play it is always good. There aren't any others like that. All of Zabelle's records are good. They're all pretty sad. There aren't other records like that. You may notice it is a completely different melody and mode from the one we heard Shah-Mouradian sing. The one, if you've heard it in concert being sung, it's totally different melody, right? Why is that? Zabelle says she learned Gronk from the lips of her countrymen as a little kid. That is the Bardizag specific melody. And Bardizag having gone away, we probably would never have heard the melody had it not been for Zabelle herself remembering it and then doing all this work on it, making it into like a new artwork. She adds like that long note, that's not in melody she heard when she was a kid. All of this stuff she does, she makes it into her idea of high art, right? Artist. She shows up at the studio with music and has these musicians who she's never met before get it right. That day, so Columbia Records in the 19-teens and 20s, 2 takes. Doesn't matter if you're, a musician everybody knows, or if you're an immigrant, 2 takes, a master and a backup. That's it. Zabelle made them do it 6 times that day. Yeah, which then gets very complicated for her discography because Columbia had not yet invented the idea of a best take. So they wound up issuing 3 different takes from that day. And then when she re-recorded it, March 1918, they then issued a 4th take. So there are 4 different takes. The ones from March 1917 are almost identical. You would not be able to tell them apart by ear. It's only studying them as a computer file. You can tell they're only 2 seconds apart in duration from each other. And there's small entrance and phrasing things, tiny. She worked at it, she knew exactly what she wanted, and she made them do it right, And it worked. People love that record. So let me, it's not a record review, but a guy named Harout Arakelian, who was born in 1903 and a genocide survivor, described in an article of his called The Gardens of Our City, a Armenian picnic in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, where he says, gradually the smoke of barbecued lamb would saturate the atmosphere and mix with the other smoke of burning memories. At that point, joining this mixture would be the sonorous voice of Shah-Mouradian singing Hayastan, pouring out of the throat of a morning glory horn phonograph. You would then hear the Gronk of Zabelle Panosian, and especially the Turkish language Anduni, an immigrant song called Egen Havasi, springing forth with sad fluctuations from the depths of Kemeny Minas's soul. And to this day, should you encounter a record collection from people of that generation in the United States, those are the 3 records that are always in. Shah-Mouradian singing Hayastan, Kemeny Minas singing Egen Havasi, lament for the town of Egen that was burned down after the occupation of the bank in Istanbul. Whole other story, incredibly good vocal record. Harry Kazilian's done incredible work on him. He had tuberculosis at the time, holes in his lungs while he recorded it, died 6 months later here in Fresno. Anyway, Kemeny Minas is amazing. It's a great record. I can't give it, well, I keep giving it away. It's not worth anything. It's a $10 record. There are thousands of them just stacked up that nobody wants. Great record. And back to the subject at hand, Zabelle Panosian's Gronk. It's all over the place. People love that record. All right. So here we are, 1917, 1918. She records more and she's playing concerts like crazy. We counted one weekend. She did 8 concerts between New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, riding the train back and forth, up and down, doing morning, afternoon, evening, raising money, raising money. 1919 becomes her really big peak year. Not only is she sings like a Armistice Day thing in front of General Electronic, where she sings Gronk waving the Armenian flag. Calvin Coolidge is there. But also the musical establishment of the US, their big magazine, the Musical Courier, runs an article on her as like a real singer. not just some immigrant girl who sings for the charity events, as a singer, like a real artist. And there's a big article about her in Haiguin, feminist Armenian magazine in Constantinople, Istanbul. Things are, oh, and she gets a real part. She doesn't just have to be one of these singers at a benefit thing. She gets a role as Abishag in a biblical pageant play based on the Book of Kings. It's like 300 backup singers and 500 dancers in Boston. She does that, wears a costume. And things are going good. Things are going really good. 1920. And instead of staying and building on that, see, her husband had gone to Constantinople, Istanbul in 1919 to find family. We know that. March 1920, she gets a 3-month passport for her and her 11-year-old daughter to go to Europe and maybe Istanbul, maybe northern Egypt, to try and find relatives, family. What winds up happening is she goes on tour first, goes to England, Paris, and then other places. She goes to, northern Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria. She does some shows there. Maybe she meets up with old friends, we don't know. And then she goes to Milan. And all along the way, she studies in Paris, but she stays away 3.5 years. She's just on the road as a performing, touring musician. Rents out 1,000-seaters in Paris, fills Salle Pleyel. In Milan, she sings at La Scala in the role of the Barber of Seville. People in the audience shouting, "Long live Armenia." Reviews of it are translated into Armenian and published in Egypt. Our girl, she's doing great. But the first thing she does on tour, before anything else, as soon as she gets to Paris, she tracks down Komitas. She finds him. So Komitas, the deal was when he was arrested in 1915, that night on the train, as the moon is coming through the trees, flickering in the train carriage, he's being sent off to jail, he begins hallucinating and panicking that dark forces are gathering around him and pursuing him. And he, from the rest of his life, had what we would call PTSD and depression. And he was unwell. So when they finally released him, he spent a couple of years at a psychiatric facility in Constantinople, Istanbul, and then the rest of his life in psychiatric facilities in Paris. So she goes and finds the Vardabet, the grand old man. She brings with her 2 Armenian doctors, men. They don't tell him that they're doctors because he hates doctors. And they discourage her from going because last week someone came to visit and he threw his shoes at them. So you don't know what you're getting into, so there's this trepidation. And she enters the yard of the facility where he is, talking to himself and walking around the hedge or something. And he looks up and he sees her and he says, "You remind me of someone, a student of mine." And she says, "Well, yes, I am a student of yours, but from far away, we've never met." "Oh, well, where are you from?" "Boston." Bostan, Turkish for vegetable garden. Do they grow a lot of vegetables there? She didn't take it as a joke. She thought he is not keeping track of what's actually going on, and she's very uncomfortable. She doesn't say anything, and then finally comes out with, "Actually, I'm here because I wanted to ask you some questions, if that's okay, Reverend Father." And he says, "Go, ask away. What would you like to know?" And she says, "Well, the music that you composed for choir, is it okay to sing those for solo voice?" And he says, "Yeah, if you know the song, sing it however you want. It's yours, my daughter. Take it, do what you like." Sometimes the piano fetters the voice. She says, "That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And I don't want to tire you out." And he says, "Sure. Okay. Well, sometime you come back, you sing for me, I'll sing for you." And she says, "I'll do that." And she wrote an article describing the entire experience, which was published in La Renaissance in Paris. Harry and Harout seem to disagree about who found it. One of them did, it wasn't me. Harry translated it. The whole thing is in the book. It is, as far as I'm concerned, the centerpiece. It is the only thing we have of her speaking in her own voice as an artist and a researcher and a serious dedicated musician who was doing her own work to try and get to the, build what she wanted to build, right? She ends the article by saying, I believe someday the Vedarpit will be cured and we will all again sing together, Ganchik Room, Ganchik Room. Anyway, she comes home after 3 years of all this touring, studying, back to Aram. He had moved household from Somerville, Boston, to New York City. Got a nice apartment on 187th Street. And she and her now 15-year-old daughter, who has spent her entire adolescence touring as an artist in cabs and hotels, backstage with other artists. Yeah, the two of them show back up, welcome back into the fold of the family. Her sister, her two brothers are there in New York City. But America has changed. There is more Armenian musical activity going on, to which she's kind of excluded. She's not really in. She was doing something else all that time, becoming a famous soprano. And then we have Arshan Malalan is touring all over America, which is a stage play, an operetta thing that there was a movie of. Anyway, yeah, she's not really part of that. So she just tries to continue what she was doing as a single thread from Europe. In Italy, let's say, the last couple of concerts she did, she presented herself not just as Zabelle Panosian, but using her husband's first name as her surname, so Zabelle Aram. When she comes to the United States, the Armenian press presents her as Zabelle Aram, and then under in parentheses, Zabelle Panosian is who you remember her as. So she becomes Zabelle Aram. Why? Bunch of reasons. Let's do one first. One is all the work that she did in the teens fit into the Near East Relief Campaign, this massive philanthropic effort that permeated all the United States and sent millions and millions and millions of dollars to Christians in Anatolia during the First World War. Huge philanthropic effort. She's part of that. She's one of the people going around, help us, help us. But that effort drilled into the minds of Americans everywhere that the word Armenian is always preceded with the word starving, a reduction of an entire people to their suffering and their victimhood, right? I was raised in the 80s, and it was the Ethiopians, right? And a friend of mine raised in the 50s in Baltimore was told as a kid, eat your vegetables, don't you know they're starving Armenians? In the 50s. It just permeated the culture, right? So it's a step back from that starving Armenian thing, Zabelle Aram. It's a little more vague. Could be from a lot of places, right? Also, 1924 is Johnson-Reed. Now, everywhere I go, I ask people to raise their hands if they know what the Johnson-Reed Act is, and it's almost always 2. I'm going to ask this audience and see if it's more. 1? Far out, man. Always the same. Johnson-Reed is the quota system for immigration. It's the way in which they set a number of people who could arrive from every country on earth. More Germans than Irish, more Irish than Italians, more Italians than Greeks, more than others, right? How did they arrive at those numbers? From an 1890 census. It was an overt attempt to reset America, the shade of waspy white that it was, preceding this massive wave of immigration of people who were darker-eyed, darker complected, more Catholic. And it worked. It worked. One of the reasons it worked was because the whole public was convinced that people from Southern and Eastern Europe were vastly more inclined toward feeble-mindedness and criminality. Big experts did studies of mental hospitals and prisons and demonstrated this proof, right? Big hit song in 1920 by Nora Bayes. Nora Bayes sang Over There, oh, the big World War I song. Nora Bayes had another big hit in 1920 called The Argentines, the Portuguese, and the Greeks. It was re-recorded by Eddie Cantor, by the Duncan sisters, by Edward Meeker. And one of the verses goes, there's the Argentines and the Portuguese, the Armenians and the Greeks. They don't know the language, they don't know the law, yet they vote in the country of the free. Now the funny thing, when we start to sing, my country 'tis of thee, none of us know the words but the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. It's a song about the ambivalence of being in this changing demographic, about it's getting a little weird around here. There are these people from other places, exotic, strange. Not sure it's okay with me, but what are you gonna do? Now there are landlords, they drive the nice cars. Malarkey. Anyway, so party har, right? There's also no Argentines that arrive in the United States from that point, at that point. So that's all baloney as well. Massive wave of inward integration to Argentina. But there's other stuff we could talk about with that song. But that's the America Zabelle returns to. It's a xenophobic, anti-immigrant America. And she does concerts in New York. She rents out Town Hall and the Garrick Theater in Boston, 1,000 seaters, fills them, and gets snarky reviews in Brooklyn about, well, really all she's good at are these quasi-Oriental airs that she saves for the end. I mean, you can just guess her nationality. But what the show actually is 2 hours where she gets up. First she does quarter of the thing in Italian, then in French, then in English, then in Armenian, with a costume change for each one. Pardon me. Demonstrating the international quality of her art. She's not just an Armenian girl, right? Over the course of the 20s, she tours. She comes here to California, 26. She plays, gets into a car wreck. There's a high school student driving her, a teacher, and her accompanist. 26, the car flips over, she breaks a few ribs, she's in shock, bruises, takes a month, she recovers, plays in Reedley. She gets a manager, starts doing radio all the time, 10, 15-minute appearances every week. She's doing lots of stuff, but the gigs are getting fewer and fewer, and the other acts on the bill are becoming more like comedy dancer, dog act, less of the kind of serious artist that she was used to. She goes and she plays for some rich people in Florida at their private event. Yeah, things are changing for Zabelle. Okay, one thing I have to address very quickly is the question of, was she a good singer? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you a, she recorded 11 songs, one in French, everything else in Armenian. The one in French only turns up on some copies of one record as a B-side, but only some of them. It is extremely scarce. But what it is a song called Charmant Oiseau, Sweet Bird, from a very minor opera by one Lucien David called The Pearl of Brazil. It was a big song that was recorded by Luisa Tetrazzini, and 6 months before Zabelle recorded it by Amelita Galli-Curci. So I'm going to play you the last minute of Amelita Galli-Curci's version of the song, which is state-of-the-art 1918 vocal pyrotechnics. Galli-Curci was from Milanese nobility and one of the greatest singers of all time. She was the star at the Met at the time that she records this. She was an early practitioner of yoga. She's a fantastic singer. So anyway, I'm just going to play you this little 1-minute section of that song. Let me see here. Ah, yes, here we go. Beg your pardon. All right. Now let me play. Okay, so this is the last minute of the same song, some 6 months later, by Zabelle Panosian. All right? Is she as good as Gallikurchi? No, no one is. Come on, I mean, let's be real. Gallikurchi is insanely good. She's, in 1918, very good. She got better between March 1917 and June 1918. We can hear that. Her growth, the sound of her, she gets better, and she goes to Europe. She gets better and better and better. In 26, if the reviews are to be believed, she's at her best, really, which is right about when the microphone's invented. And it's a damn shame she never recorded again, right? Here's a little review I want to read you of a guy who, in the Boston periodical The Phoenix, went to see her in 1919. And he begins the review this way. Just because you're popular doesn't mean you're good. While Zabelle's vocal tone is beautiful, it is uncultivated as a flower in an untouched forest. Nature gave her the gift which needs to be cultivated to blossom to its full beauty if she focuses on European songs. This is what I thought when I accompanied her 3 years ago on piano. So he played with her in 1916 and thinks to himself, she's not, right? Here he is, 1919, and he sees her again and goes, so I went to this concert February 9th, and up until now, Zabelle was known for Armenian songs, which she sang in true Armenian style. The writer then focused on her English, and in the reaction to Meyerbeer's Shadow Song was overwhelming. People applauded it more than the Armenian songs because she was able to display her vocal talents more. Her voice competed with the flute. Her technique was great. At one point, her voice and the flute were so harmonious, one thought it was two flutes. She produced these notes with clarity and ease. It's obvious she's a better trained singer than 3 years ago. For her performance of Armenian songs, to her compliment, she didn't alter them, but instead showed a better grip. Natsa Shun, which she never recorded, was the best received of them. It's fair to say she has the best Armenian voice. In her singing style, one can hear Oriental warmth and color, and she strongly speaks to Armenians and awakens memories from home. She's good. But then what? 1932, there's an event, Harout Arakelian points out, where they have a soprano, and it would seem like Zabelle would be the one that gets hired, and they hire somebody else. Why? We don't know. Could it booking conflict? What? She's also a woman on stage. She's a good-looking girl all her life. She's a woman in the performing business. 1932, she's 41 years old. What's the joke from Veep? Julia Louis-Dreyfus says, my career is over the day I can't wear sleeveless dresses. Doesn't it happen over and over again in show business? That you get to 40 and people are just not booking you like they used to. You know, it's harder to find gigs. Showbiz. Right about this time, 1934, Zabelle's daughter Adrina breaks off, starts her own career. More on this from Harout in a minute. She changes her last name to Otero, after the famous courtesan La Belle Otero, implying that she might be La Belle Otero's daughter, vaguely, but represents herself for the rest of her life as Spanish. Lies to the press for the rest of her life that her father was Spanish and her mother was a famous opera star. She goes on tour in Europe, 1934, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 40, 41. She just makes it out of Paris the day before the Germans invade. She spends the Spanish Civil War and the onset of World War II in Spain, France, and Germany. Here she is, 1937, representing herself as Roma in Berlin, months before Roma people began to be rounded up and sent to camps in an alarming echo of the fate of her mother's own village. Anyway, Adrina had a long, fascinating career of her own, came back, toured all over, all over America. Got very involved with the Metropolitan. Marina Stedlova, the prima ballerina, and she toured all over for many years. They were very close. She, had an amazing career, wound up marrying a Jewish guy. They settled in Florida. She taught dance in her later years. She seems to be gone by about 1975. I'm not entirely sure of the date of her death yet. In true show, I went and saw Zabelle and Adrina's grave. In true showbiz style, neither of them listed their dates of birth and consistently represented themselves as 5 to 10 years younger than they really were through the rest of their lives. By 1972, do you know Kathy Barbarian, the famous singer, Armenian? She in the 60s and stuff, she was very famous. She was this wonderful classical singer who did a lot of John Cage and Beatles and stuff, kind of avant-garde. She married Lucio Berio, wonderful singer and composer. And she told Charles Armenian in San Francisco during an interview in 1972, once upon a time, there was actually an Armenian girl who was very famous, but she just kind of disintegrated into nothing. And no one knows what happened. And she's talking about Zabelle in the past tense, when Zabelle is alive and well in New York City in 1972. She lived until 1986, by which time her husband's dead, all 3 of her siblings, her sister she fell out with, not so much in touch with anybody over there. Her daughter apparently is dead, and then she's all alone. 4 years before she dies, 1982, she gives $756,939 to the Armenian General Benevolent Union at its inception, or near its inception, being then the 3rd largest donor to the AGBU in its history at that point. $2 million it is today. Here. 2 months ago, I took myself on a walking tour of Zabelle Panosian's New York City. I went to the addresses where I knew she lived. I went to her church. At the first address where I went, it was an apartment that Adrina rented in the 50s and then Zabelle moved into sometime in the 60s. I was taking photos and I walk inside the foyer. I'm kind of looking around. Okay, here we are, way up 187th Street. And there's a lady standing there with a cat waiting for somebody to pick her up, take her to the vet. And I said, when was this building built? And she said, 20s. I said, that makes sense. Okay, right. And she says, what are you doing taking pictures? I said, I'm researching a musician. She said, what kind of music? I said, Armenian opera? And she said, well, was she like this? And I said, that's her daughter. That's Adrina, who's a flamenco dancer. And she says, oh, I wish I still had that photo. They threw everything away. There were all these photos and costumes and everything. Really? Yeah, and I saved this one photo. When did you move into the building? 86. The year Zabelle died. It all got thrown away. There was no one to leave it to, no one to remember. And so I gave this woman who was there in the lobby a copy of this book that we wrote. And I said, you're part of the story now. Thank you very much. And she wrote to me the next day and took a picture of, she said, I found the photo. It's Zabelle as Abishag in 1919. Yeah. So it wasn't Adrina, it was Zabelle. So that's where everything went. In response to Zabelle's death, the AGBU wrote her obituary, which goes thus: the extremely well-loved, the extremely well-known and beloved singer of the Armenian-American old generation closed her eyes forever, leaving behind her good name and remembrance-worthy work. Peace to her tormented soul. And then what? And then nothing. Nothing. Who remembered? She was in one book. There was a book from Toronto in the 50s that includes a character named Zabelle, somebody who wants to get out of Bardizag and become a singer, written by a Presbyterian missionary. So she knew this, but who remembered? Nobody remembered. Nobody listened to the record. It was, Armenians during the middle of the 20th century went through a period of forgetting, generally exhaustion of the genocide thing. I think that's part of what's going on here. I think also that, America has not written in the stories of non-English speakers generally into our musical history. So that's really my big problem, yes, it is a problem. My big program is to reintroduce America to our own heritage of what we've accomplished here that is in languages other than English. I think it is central to the project of American musical culture that we begin to understand that we are not just this limited idea of who we are and what we say we are. Thanks.
Right.
Me the next day, and
Okay, thank you all. I'll be pretty brief, just a few minutes. Excuse me. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to UCLA, to the Modern Armenian History Program, the NARI Studies Program, the UCLA Armenian Music Program, and the Promise Armenian Institute. We're very fortunate to be here today, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to speak about Zabelle Panosian. Over 100 years ago, Zabelle's voice was recorded, documented, captured on these dusty, fragile discs made of shellac and concrete. Recorded was her musical expression, and today her records have become artifacts in time. In 1917, her music was new, her art was new, and the phonograph medium was new. The story of Armenian music in America really starts in 1909 with Martiros Tersakis-Tashjan, and Martiros arrived to the United States in 1892 at the age of 12, and by 1918, he would relocate to California. But before he moves to California, Martiros and his brother were selling Zabelle Panosian's records. Is it being blocked? Okay. Yeah, Martiros and his brother Levon Tersakis-Tashjan were selling Zabelle's records, and it's part of the story of the distribution of music. And during this time, Armenag Shah-Mouradian, one of Zabelle's main contemporaries, magnificently displayed the importance of recording Armenian music in America. While our book was a production of shared research, I was tasked with the photographic research. And what's presented in the book is a mixture that's really found in newspapers, a wide variety of publications, be it Armenian-American, international press. Her singing attracted attention from Fresno to Istanbul, from Paris to Cairo, and back to New York. We also included a great number of photographs of Adrina that represented her entertainment career, and that was really done with Ian's outreach to family and others as well. To get to know the Panosian story, we really turned to genealogical resources, and that's when we understood Zabelle's story just a little bit better. And as I said, our book consists of about 50 photographs, which were published in an assortment of publications, be it Shah and Natalie's literary journal from Boston and Providence, Gavroche in Paris, Gurung in Horizon in Philadelphia. And these publications is where our co-author, Harout Arakelian, really helped and contributed with some top-notch translations for the book. One of the great and vital resources that we had that we utilized a great deal was the National Library of Armenia's newspaper archive. We were able to download an enormous number of digitized publications, predominantly in Armenian language. And between Harry and I, we would split up the years, divvy up the months, and just try and find as much information. I would find Zabelle's name, send it over to him to see what the rest of the article said. And his translations are a really strong part of the book. Ian discussed this earlier, and it's the most significant part of the book, Zabelle's visit to Komitas Vardabet. Again, we were able to track down, to locate, discover the full article, and Harry was able to give us the translation. American newspapers was also a great resource. As Ian said, the Musical Courier covered her a great deal. And countless items that were always in the press were accompanied with photographs, which helped with my part of the story. We gathered information and images from a variety of sources, especially the label that recorded her, Columbia Records. Columbia published numerous adverts with Zabelle's likeness and even a few catalogs that had more information. But while currently Columbia's documentation is near non-existent, we relied on Richard K. Spotswood's Ethnic Music on Records, as well as other discographical research that's been done to get a better understanding of what her recorded output was. And then we pieced it together by having the physical records and looking at the information on there. But to be specific of Zabelle's story to California, this is the first article that we've seen, dated 1916 to the Osvaldes newspaper in Fresno, published in Fresno. It's a short, brief piece, 1916, still kind of early in her career, highlighting what she's doing locally. Zabelle's husband, Harout Panosian, had some success in the postcard industry with the Tickner brothers. While he produced, I have some of them over here that people might want to look at. While he produced some of the early flight-related postcards, later in 1912, he produces a series for California. Again, these were copyrighted to 1912, but we don't know if Harout himself traveled to California to be able to produce these. A more specific marker of Zabelle's time in California starts in our book in chapter 6 with a review of Zabelle Panosian's and Armenag Shah-Mouradian's concert in New York City in 1917. The review is critical, the author is very harsh, and it was written by composer and music director Krikot Kafayan. It's interesting because a few months prior to his critical review of Zabelle's music, Prof. Kafayan and Zabelle performed together in concert. A little bit about Kafayan's story is that by the early 20s, he resettles in Fresno, California, and is music director at the Holy Trinity Armenian Church and other Armenian churches in the area. Kafayan was a contemporary of Komitas's, and like Shah-Mouradian, while in France, he studies with Vincent Dandy. Kafayan even publishes an early Armenian French language music journal titled Gurung, and his published music over the years was recorded by a great number of musicians. Maybe not a great number, but it was constantly recorded and performed live. Kafayan also had what might be the first Armenian-owned record label in California. What Kafayan did is in 1925, he takes out a page-and-a-half advertisement in the Osvaldes saying, in 2 years, I'm going to publish a collection of records. And he does that just in time for Christmas of 1927. This is probably my favorite one of the set. Who Are You? Ovestun. What other interactions Zabelle and Kafayan had, we're not sure of yet. But Zabelle, and we believe possibly she might have toured or visited California earlier, but one of the ones that for sure we know is December of 26 when she comes to California for a tour. But it wasn't a smooth ride. The first notice that we see of her visit is from December 8th, and it's published in Fresno Morning Republican about her concert in a few days at the Fresno High School auditorium. On the 11th, it informs us of the newspaper article informs us of the program that she's going to present. Zabelle is accompanied by Daniel Popovich, a Fresno area concert pianist, and two local young Armenian musicians, Richard Serafian, a flutist, and Armenian Arakelian, a violinist. Both of them would be musicians in the Fresno area over the next decades. But of the 6 works that they presented that were by Armenian composers, none were by Prof. Kafayan. They didn't get along. Now that concert went well. The Fresno Bee wrote a nice review. And Zabelle then performed in San Francisco on December 19th. And it's believed that she was on her way down to Los Angeles to perform here for the holiday season. But she was going to make a stop in Fresno before she travels down to LA. And on December 21st, Zabelle Panosian was in a car accident in Merced. She suffered from broken ribs, bruises, and abrasions, and severe shock. Now, we don't know if the accident had any long-term effects on her, how it affected her voice or her life, but we do know that Zabelle was back on the stage in almost less than a month. And on January 23rd, 27, she performs at a concert in Reedley. And it was well received, the concert itself. By November of that year, she's back in New York City in a production of Barbara of Seville. And we have pretty much a long gap with just small little fragments. And we have one piece of information that we want to believe it's Zabelle. We're not sure. In the late 40s, the Armenian-owned record label published this record with kindergarten songs. The pianist accompanying the vocalist is a Zabelle. It could be Zabelle Panosian. I believe it is. But the record label, I want to say a few words about that, because it was a very important record label in Los Angeles, Armenian-owned, and the shop itself, or the operation itself, actually starts in 1935, but when he started pressing Armenian music, we're not sure the exact date. It was established by Ed Nazareth in downtown Los Angeles in 1935. And this photo is what it looked like in 1935. And here's what it looks like today. Quite a different building. But a little bit more about the record. The content of the recording is what seems like an instructional, not for kindergarten children, but for kindergarten teachers. The woman that accompanies her, it says, Y Mushan, Yeranuhi Jeroma Mushan. She was an Armenian school teacher in the Los Angeles area, as well as a Sunday school teacher at the St. James Church for many years. Yeranuhi was heavily involved with, she was born in 1905 in Hajin to the Gazarian family. And she grew up in LA. She was very active in AGBU, particularly in Hollywood, and with the Armenian Allied Arts. She briefly tried her hand on screen, and she had a very small role in a film, Five Fingers, starring James Mason. This movie also had numerous other Armenians in it. Yedhashe Harout Arakelian, Akim Tamarov's brother-in-law, Konstantin Shane. And then this film was later converted or turned into a television show, which the star of the show is David Hedison, who's an Armenian. It's interesting because that's two television productions with Armenians in the leads. Now, while it looks like Zabelle Panosian never attempted a career in motion pictures, her daughter Adrina did. She had a very brief life on screen. Her professional career was really launched in earnest in 1933 or 34, where she parlayed her experiences in Spanish dance into a series of appearances in short films produced by the Educational Pictures Company and starring the new comedian Bob Hope. In 1934, Adrina appeared in two films with Bob Hope, at least two films. There's a third one as well, but two that I'm showing here. While Going Spanish was Bob Hope's first film, and a film he did not quite like. By the time they got to Soup for Nuts, Adrina was included in a poster art. I want to thank you all for your patience and your time in listening to this talk. But I want to conclude with a brief scene from Going Spanish. Adrina's very short scene from the film.
Silent film?
Well, Sunday school teacher. There is audio to it. There's Spanish music. It's not anything quite special, and it's a very short clip. We don't have audio. It's okay. It's going to conclude in just a moment. If anybody really wants to see it, I can play it another time.
Seems pretty risque for the time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Bob Hope, vaudeville.
Adrina was fearless. She was a pinup eventually and other things. Yeah, model. Yeah.
In closing, I just want to say Zabelle Panosian's star was bright. She was constant during her most active years. Her contributions to the landscape of art and culture has proven that, without a doubt, she has stood the test of time. It's always really exciting to talk about her, and I'm really excited about the unknowns that are still to be discovered. Thank you all for your time.
We have about 25 minutes or so for Q&A. So
Yes.
Do you know why Adrina gave up her Armenian?
Same reason I suspect that lots of other Armenian performers gave up their Armenian names. So who was the woman that was on What's My Line in the 1950s, this big star? Arlene Francis. They were friends. She went over, Adrina and Zabelle went over Arlene Francis's house for Thanksgiving in the 50s. And on my efforts to find somebody who had been in the same room with Zabelle, I contacted Arlene Francis's son, who was then 5 years old, to see if he remembered her, because he would be one of two living people that we know of who had ever been in the room with her. Anyway, Arlene Francis changed her name to avoid discrimination. You know, it's Jews in show business, from Milton Berle to Bob Dylan. It's a cliche, you know, assimilate. I think that's why.
what was her real name, Arlene Francis?
I don't remember, but I bought her autobiography specifically to find if there might be any reference to either Zabelle or Adrina, and there is not. And there's a chapter about growing up and her devotion to her father, who's Armenian, and food and music and things that he gave her. She identifies very strongly as Armenian.
Yeah, she always promoted her Armenian.
Is she the one who sang, why don't you come on over to my house?
No.
K. Armen.
Sorry?
K. Armen.
Okay.
Yeah, and was written by Saroyan and Bardizag.
Kazanjian.
Oh, right.
Kazanjian.
That's right.
Okay.
And right, so Ross Bagdasarian becomes David Simon of Alvin and the Chipmunks.
David Seville.
David Seville, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, David Seville.
So there were some well-known Armenians who did sing opera within New York Met. Lily Chukassian comes to mind, who happens to be a childhood friend of my mother's. And so she was with the Met in the late 50s till the mid 70s, maybe later than that. So I wonder if she might have had some connection, because I mean, she was probably old enough to be Adrina's age, maybe. I don't know.
Or older.
Lucina Mara.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, that
Mara
might be an
Wajemian,
avenue
also a bit
to
later.
explore.
Yeah, that's interesting to know and think
Lily's
about.
children, I think, are
In the 1940s, during the Second World War, when America had to justify itself as we're a segregated country and we have to show the rest of the world, but no, see, we're really nice and welcoming after all, even though we have this horribly racist immigrant policy and Black people aren't allowed on the bus and all this stuff. There became a fashionable thing of being interested in hyphenated Americans. And there began to be among some people, a certain strata of society, I think, a fashion for reading books by immigrants. Saroyan certainly was one of those people. Who was the guy, Salom Rizik, who wrote Syrian Yankee, big bestseller. So yeah, I think things changed and got a little better. And then you had people like Hovannes got famous and identified really strongly as Armenian, even though he was half Scottish.
Oh, he's half Scottish?
Yeah, his mother.
His father was from Adana.
It was a Greek mystic who convinced him to recognize the fact that he was a reincarnated Armenian. And that he had to.
Is that what it takes? Okay.
A Greek mystic with an Italian stage name.
Right, that's true. And then he gets a job playing as an organist in Watertown with the Armenian church. Yeah, stories. Yes.
Kind of technical questions, maybe. I wonder if two little things that I know, do they connect or not? I've seen Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and I wonder if it's correct to imagine the technical process of recording and the permanence of it that you are talking about. Is it the same or is it different? I can explain.
As what? Because I haven't seen it, I'm sorry.
Oh, all right. Have you?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's basically about Ma Rainey and her first recordings. But I would think the main difference is Columbia Studios versus, I don't remember, what's the record label
Paramount.
she first? Paramount?
Yeah.
And they were a much smaller operation.
Yeah, and they were run out of a furniture company, but it's basically, it's the same process through a horn. It's not microphones. It's all acoustical. So it's pressed on a similar stuff that's ground stone mixed with shellac and maybe some fiber and carbon black. But yeah, notably, speaking of immigrants being recorded starting sort of 1910, and then, Zabelle is this star by 1917, Black women in America were not recorded commercially until March of 1920. It is sad commentary that their status was so low. Yeah, it was Mamie Smith, Crazy Blues was the first one. OK Records wasn't one of the major companies. It was an independent company, right? And then Trixie Smith, Clara Smith, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, all these people who changed America forever, right? So
Going to your question, if I'm not mistaken, Ma Rainey recorded with a microphone. In the film, that's how it's depicted, right?
oh, they screwed it up?
No, maybe it was a later
Oh, okay, so
recording,
they were
or
talking
they're-
about in 1926 thereafter.
Yeah. So
But here's the
Zabelle wasn't, the microphone wasn't invented by that point.
So, like, what might it have looked like?
As
Okay.
She was.
Bighorn.
You go into the studio, it's the 7th floor of the Woolworth building. It's a big horn. Maybe other smaller horns connected by tubes to the cutting machine, which is a thick wax platter on it. And what happens is the studio engineer shows you a green card, start, and you sing into the horn. The vibrations in the air flow down the horn, are condensed at the bottom, vibrate a diaphragm. That diaphragm vibrates the needle, which cuts into the disc. Purely mechanical process.
Blind. Okay.
No electricity involved whatsoever. And then the record player that somebody has at home is the exact reverse process. Needle vibrates, a diaphragm sends waves of air up through a tube, a horn out into the room. All mechanical, no electricity involved at all.
And so that means one take, right?
Right.
Like there's no editing, nothing like that.
Oh, right. So you get to almost the end of the side and they show you a yellow card, wrap it up. Red card is like side's done, ruin take. So, yeah.
I've got a question and a comment. So the question I think I know the answer to it, unfortunately, but I'll ask it nonetheless.
I'll make one up.
Sure, you can. So you mentioned one work by her that has come down to us in the form of a newspaper article. I think you said in a French journal.
Yes,
But I assume
Armenian
it was
French.
published in
Very
Armenian. Verazanut. Okay, so I said-
The Renaissance is the one I
yeah,
said.
Verazanut. So, but it's an Armenian paper.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
she wrote. Okay, so do we? Well, the answer is no, I think. But are there any other documents that historians refer to as eco documents? That is to say, documents written in first person, whether in the form of a memoir, a letter, even bills, or anything legally, anything involving a legal process in the courts that include her as a person
If you would
that have
ask,
survived, especially letters. So obviously the 1970,
oh, right, who did she-
1986 trash, the big trash bonfire
Yeah.
materials
Mhm.
probably destroyed whatever there was. But I think like any letter writer, she would have been writing to other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
It's
are
a
there-
very good question. Does the AGBU, for instance, have an archive
Yes.
of early correspondence?
You
Could
would
she
think
be in
that
there?
for $700,000 in 1972, there
You'd
would
get
be
a little note or something.
some kind
Well,
of.
that's a good point, because what
And there are
we
these
have about
authors that she was
well,
involved with.
Bardizag Karens, her great nephew.
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah.
one thing that he remembers her as a doting grandmother, but he also remembers that almost every year she would send them a postcard, a letter, a card for a birthday, for the holiday season.
And none of this is
Her
complete.
husband, her husband made these. So
He gave
it's
us two photos for the book.
So it's
The two
possible.
that he had.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
He also saw an article that I wrote about her about 5 or 6 years ago in the Armenian Weekly in Watertown, and contacted me and told me that he didn't know that she was a singer. He later revised and said, well, I knew she was a singer. I didn't know she had a big career or anything, but it never came up in conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So the two comments I had one initially, but I came up with another one. Are first a comment about Grung or Grung, right? The most famous piece that she recorded, I take it.
Yeah, I think so.
Obviously, Komitas Vardabet had a very important role in that, and it is something that is almost emblematically Armenian as you can get in terms of a song and a metaphor. The crane as a metaphor for exile and for nostalgia for a lost home. Yet, the comment I have is that it is actually, like many things in the world of the Armenians, not exclusively Armenian. In
Absolutely.
fact, it is actually Turkish. It is probably also Kurdish and involves all the people that lived in that same area, whether they liked it or not, for good or for bad in terms of cross-cultural interactions that made up a sense of who they were in this world.
Mhm.
So if anybody is interested, Michael Pfeiffer has an excellent essay on this topic called Krung or something like that in the journal Diaspora,
Mhm.
which I read a long time ago. So I may be messing up, my memory might be affecting my understanding and appreciation of the piece, but it's actually directly tackles this issue of how one looks at and studies objects, metaphors, analogies that flow seamlessly from one culture to another, and yet at some point in time can be seen exclusively as one culture's heritage, whereas in fact they bespeak of something larger and shared. So just a comment on that.
That's very interesting. I believe I read the article myself some years ago and I'd kind of forgotten about it until you mentioned it. It's worth pointing out that the Songs of Armenia that was edited by Palian, who was a scientist who came out to California, became a mystic, and Ikuni, who was this violin player in Syracuse, very kind of dour, reluctant guy. He accompanied Zabelle and Shah-Mouradian in 1916-17 while they were on tour. And he publishes all of its, there's 6 songs in here that Zabelle sang on records and a number that Shah-Mouradian did. Grunk is in here. And it's Shah-Mouradian's version. It's not Zabelle's version. Yeah. So that was taken to be, I think, the standard. Her version, I mean, you referenced Grunk as being a song that belongs to many cultures.
Well, I'm not sure if it's
From-
the song that belongs. I think the metaphor
text.
belongs.
Oh, the metaphor, I see.
Yeah, at the very least, but
Yes.
I would have to refresh my memory.
There is a recording from 1923 of the Romaniot Jewish singer Amalia Bacchus singing a song which in Turkish translates to "Crane, where are you coming from?" She was from Yanina, northern Greece near the Albanian border. and plays with, I think, Marco Melkon, who's from Izmir on that. Anyway, so it's a Turkish, I have not yet gotten the Turkish translated and need to begin to understand the genealogy of the song, if I can better. But Zabelle's recording of Grunk is not only all of that backstory of all of those cosmopolitan mix of cultures and things, it's also American.
Sure.
Her version of it is distinctly of America and incorporates, hybridizes American aesthetics. So.
Of course, yeah. So the other comment I had to make was, it's incredible how much of the world one can read using a small sliver of memory, right? In this case, your archive seems to be her voice, that recording that you listen to, and yet based on just the sonorous tone of her voice, you and your team are able to read the entire world into this archive in terms of Ottoman history, genocide, American race relations in the 20s, why she fell out of favor here, why she might have been forgotten and consigned to amnesia at a certain point in time, and so on. So it's a really interesting kind of example, thought-provoking example of what one can do with microhistory and with music as an archive, and not necessarily with written documents as such.
Records are great, and musicians are a fascinating way to look at history because they fit socially in so many different levels. And they're people who, whether they're at a lower social strata or they're mixing with people of higher social strata, have dedicated themselves to expression of something directly to the other people in their audience at that time. It's what they do. And to be able to hear them in real time, of course, everything I know about the world comes from records. So I'm a big fan, and I want to encourage everyone to think about musicians and records as a way of understanding the world that I think is sometimes represented outside of music departments and sometimes not.
One little comment about Grunk, as far as I know from my own research, there's a book in Armenian that traces the song, the lyrics obviously, back to the medieval times. Basically, it was a medieval dog, and some scholars attribute it to I think Kuchak, but there were also variants. So we don't know if it was a poet who wrote it, or I mean, obviously, like from the medieval times to today, it branched out to variants, and now, like in the 19th century, it was labeled as folk. But we know that it was a medieval dog, probably by Nabet Kuchak. But the interesting thing about Grung is, I mean, I don't want to diverge from Zabelle, but even Armenag Shah-Mouradian's performance is not what Komitas arranged.
Oh, interesting.
So that's, I mean, they worked together, as you said, they recorded together, and Armenag added his own interpretation, and because it was a folk song by then, so Komitas basically was trying to create this elite, art song repertoire, but everybody else, like Zabelle or Armenag, they were singing it the way they wanted to sing it. So I mean, it's so telling that it's Grunk that kind of like drew you into Zabelle's world, because I guess yeah, it's an art song, but to this day I think it's that song that gives you a lot of space for creative license, basically. My actual question is something else related to Sebu's question. So in terms of letters, yes, of course, like especially in feminist historiography, we use personal letters by women a lot. I know that there are letters not by her, but this is in your book, and I was going to ask you, I forgot before, who wrote recommendations for her to get the passport when she was traveling to? So you were asking about a document that had her name on it, right?
Just any documentation.
Any document, yeah.
Anything biographical. It's,
Yes, I think those are the recommendation letters, right? She collected.
Her passport application, according to the immigration stuff, includes letters of recommendation from her bank and her music teacher.
So do we have that music teacher letter?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I never.
No, we don't have the letter that
letter.
Duena herself wrote recommending Zabelle. Do we? I don't think so.
It's in the genealogical.
We know
document.
very little about her. She's been really difficult to find anything about. I don't know when she died. I found her date of birth for her, which again might be baloney. But yeah, she's a hard nut to crack.
Do you know much about the community in which she lived in Bardizag? For example, which church she was affiliated with? Because there is a
Sorhago.
community.
St.
So it
James.
was a Lusavarchagan church.
Okay.
Is that right? It was.
I don't know that much about the Armenian church. to be
Protestants
able to
have a
say
lot of
anything.
documentation.
Right.
from
Yeah.
Bardizag, but if she's not affiliated.
Yeah.
What about the church on 187th Street, New York?
yes.
Yeah. She was. Yeah. She lived 3 blocks away.
Yeah,
And we think that she was there in whatever it was,
Yeah.
34 during the
Yeah.
assassination.
yeah.
No? Wow.
I would love to be able to talk with somebody. I left them through the mail slot a signed copy of the book, hoping that we could connect someday. Nobody was there when I went.
Yeah, that's.
I actually know the organist, the harmonium player. I used to sing in that church, so I just now made the connection.
First, I'd like to thank you, congratulate you, commend you, all 3 of you. We owe you, all 3 of you, a debt of gratitude. Our community does for bringing this person and this person's voice back to life. So we thank you for that,
Welcome.
because
Fun.
I'm sure there were long hours put into this, a lot of digging. Obviously, you guys have unearthed quite a bit of information that could not have been easy to find. So thank you for that. I'm going to try to sneak in 2 questions here. The first one is an easy one. Did Zabelle Panosian have a vocation other than singing? Because it seems that she had amassed a small fortune that she ultimately gave away, or was that through her husband's postcard business? Did she have any other education?
Census records only give her as a housewife.
Okay.
Yeah. It's his money.
Okay. The second question is that I was introduced to you from listening to a podcast from 2019, the Ephemeral podcast, and I think it was entitled Diaspora, in which you were interviewed. And you talked about the Ottoman ethnic influence in American music, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
And
some
you talked about
examples.
not only Armenian influence, but Turkish, Arabic, and Greek influence as well. Perhaps you could comment on your journey of that discovery, because obviously you're immersed in that world quite a bit, and maybe talk a little bit about your introduction to the Armenian community, where you acquired this interest, because correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like you have a great interest, great passion for the Armenian component of that. And another corollary to that, when we talk about the Ottoman ethnic influence in American music, where does Armenian influence fall in the broader rubric of things? In terms of the volume, in terms of the influence? So
I think I
multiple
understand.
questions.
Yeah, I think I can answer them pretty quickly. I began buying foreign language 78 RPM discs at random in my late teens. And some of them turned out to be interesting to me musically for a variety of reasons. Somewhere in my 20s at Stereo Jack's in Boston, great record store, 25 cents a piece. I got a Naim Karakhan record on Columbia, and I got Achilles Poulos's Nedim Gedim Amerikaya, Why I Came to America. Giant 100,000 seller, 12-inch hit record in Turkish. Then 2004-5, somebody brought in a bunch of Greek records into my record store. There was a record in there by Marika Papagika, also on Columbia from, it turns out, 1919. Having seen Arabic, Turkish, and Greek records that sounded like kind of similar to me, and all having green Columbia labels, I thought, did these people know each other? Was there a scene? What's going on here? Who are these people? Why is this music good to me? And I began to go looking for stories. One of the places I went to go look for stories was the Armenian Museum in Watertown, Massachusetts. I put out word with all my friends, hey, if you see any of these records, Turkish, Armenian, Arabic, Greek, let me know. My friend Angela Sawyer, who ran Weirdo Records in Boston, wrote to me and said, yeah, I got a big stack of them under my TV. You want them? A friend of hers had found them on the street and given them to her because she knew she liked records, and she just kept them because they were, kind of interesting, different, not something you see every day. And they just waited there, and she gave me this stack of early 20s Armenian records, and I put them on, and I liked it. And then I started asking around and asking around. So that's the answer to the first part of your question, I suppose. The answer to the second part of the question is, what is the relative weight and value of Armenian music in American culture? Okay, well, there are way fewer Armenians, or were early 20th century, teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, right? Way fewer Armenians than there were Greeks. There are way fewer Greeks than there are Italians. There were fewer Albanians than there were Armenians. So they made like way fewer records. So way fewer people thought about the Albanians. So it's really just a matter of volume. It's just how many you can sell. The music business is run on money, not on any beneficent thing of like preservation of culture. They don't care. They never have. It's only about how much money can we make off of these people. So how many people are there? They sell more records. They've got more weight. That's it. I found one or two instances of ladies' teas in the 19 teens and 20s where they would listen to foreign ethnic records for fun and feel good about themselves for doing so. And they listened to Marika Papagika and Zabelle Panosian. Just these couple of occasions. Also, my other big favorite thing, whistling records. A major feminist movement in the early 20th century, women whistling in public. It's a whole other thing. Don't get me started. But there's no genocide in that story, which is great. So it's much more fun to do sometimes. So, anyway.
And what about the orange? You were going to tell us about the orange label?
Oh, the orange label apparently was a very brief World War I era charity label. So I believe there are only 12 artists who had the orange label. They were all, except 2 Arabs, Western trained immigrants. A Greek guy who sang as a tenor classically, just a handful of people, Shah-Mouradian, Bardizag, and Zabelle Panosian. 3 of the 12 were Armenians. I believe it was a charity label. There were earlier iterations of it where there were actually pictures of like starving orphans that were in orange and green. And then they changed it to orange, and then the orange label stops immediately with the war. They reissue Zabelle's material on green and gold labels, and then later in the mid-20s, Grunk comes out on a laminated disc that sounds way better with the dark green label. That's the one to get if you need a copy of Take 7. So that's the story of the orange label.
We have time for just 2 more questions, and then afterwards we have coffee and some small nibbles to feast on if anybody wants, and we can also feast on each other's company. So the question next goes to the gentleman with the glasses. Yes,
Thank
you have your hand up for what?
So before the advent of the website Bandcamp and your fabulous Canary Records page, I would frequent a musical blog posted on Blogger called Record Theme. And it was based in Chicago by a fellow named Scott. I've lost touch with him. I think my last email with him was 10 years ago. He had a very similar project to that of Canary Records. He would collect classic LPs from different cultures within America, very all-American flair, and write a wonderful blog post explaining each one's provenance. And I was simply wondering, in the course of your scholarship, did you at all come across this now defunct blog, anything regarding this fellow's projects? Because I could place the 2 of you in a very similar category. American men fascinated by his fine multicultural American past. And if you at all came across that past, because he has now passed that project and it's no longer around, but after I was unable to download his music because he hosted it in obscure hosting sites online before Bandcamp was a thing. You're basically his spiritual successor in my mind.
Oh, I see.
Is there anything to that in your world?
I never heard of Scott before. I never came across Record Fiend. I think it's I'm a manifestation of a larger impulse that largely began with the Finnish guy Pekka Granau in the 70s, who first pointed out that, you know, we could really be listening to these, and I bet there's a lot of good stuff in there. Finnish guy. So this immigrant record stuff. That was picked up on by a guy named Dick Spotswood. Spotswood wrote the 7-volume set that the University of Indiana published in the 1990s, which is a complete discography of every record made between 1890 and 1941 in a language other than English in the United States. There. It's basically all there. And he keeps working on it and adding to it. Anyway, so Spotswood is somebody that I'm very, very fond of. And I ask him questions all the time. I try and give him matrix numbers when I find stuff missing. So there's a larger cultural impulse toward this thing of which I am a manifestation, I suppose. Pat Conte in New Jersey. Anyway.
Any other questions? All right, so why don't we convene at the table in the back? And thank our speakers.